Chapter Spooks.
G'day, and welcome to Chapter Spooks, where we talk about the books that keep your kids up at night. I'm your podcast host, Matthew A.J. Anderson, a horror author, narratologist, word nerd, and blood sommelier. And today, we'll be breaking the spines on a new series, the trilogy to close off this first season of Chapter Spooks, Creeptown by Scott Charles. Now, I'm going to start by saying that I was a little disappointed to learn that Creeptown is just the title of the series. It doesn't actually imply anything about the series, which, it's a little disappointing. Even if you just use the same name for the town every time, it doesn't even need to be Creeptown, even if it's just, some creepy name. That would have made me a little happier, but honestly, it doesn't really matter. That's just a personal preference. So long as your title implies that these are some horror book series, and each one has its own title so that you know that they're not an ongoing, continuous, episodic type series, that's perfectly fine. And since this is the first time we're getting to know him, the author of all three of these books is Scott Charles. He's the guy responsible for all of these. And from what I can tell, there's not really all that much to say. He wrote the 3 books of Creeptown. He wrote 3 books in a series called Video Game Elementary, which seems rather interesting as a concept. And he seems to be working on something called Dragon League. So as you can see, it's all sort of this sort of kiddie, fun, action-y, adventure-y sort of stuff. This seems to be the only time he's delved into horror, and I gotta say, I don't think he's all that good at it. Right, with all due respect, like, some of the character stuff seems quirky, and especially for something like Video Game Elementary or some sort of fantasy world with dragons, I can understand it working, but I don't think it really works for this. Which is a shame, because, so this first book in the series is called The Final Ingredient. And from not only the title, but also the blurb on the back, you get the idea that this is going to be about a kid who is making these strange recipes, and they're being forced to get these gross, unusual, Halloween-y type ingredients for their strange recipes that they're making. And that's sort of going to be the driving thrust of this book. And that's an interesting idea. I really like that. It's that horror with a slice of cheese that I always talk about with Chapter Spooks books, that's how you sort of make it kid-friendly, by making it a little bit goofy, a little bit cheesy. But it seems like at every opportunity, this book undercuts the potential of these ideas by weakening them, softening them, or throwing in stuff that's completely random and doesn't actually add to the story. In fact, it detracts from the story. It's... You know what, it's once again a case where, I don't know if I can just explain it to you. I'm going to have to go through the summary and show you what it is about this book that I find so underwhelming. So, let's just get into it. This is Creeptown #1, The Final Ingredient. So this book starts right in the middle of things, in medias res, with Tammy about to pour some slugs into cookie batter. Because she's thinking to herself, can I really do this? This seems so evil. This seems like such a horrible thing to do. But then she thinks to herself, no. I need revenge for what Denise did to me. And so she pours the slugs in, stirs it through, and puts the cookies into the oven. And then we get to the next chapter, where it says, 1 day earlier. And we get to see what led up to this. So we're introduced to our main character, Tammy, and Tammy has a web video channel. It's basically a YouTube channel. I'm going to call it that, even though the book never does, because, branding. But she's got a YouTube channel called Tammy Bakes, where she bakes all kinds of beautiful looking recipes. See, she wants to be a celebrity chef when she gets older. She loves cooking. She loves the fact that you can take all of these bland ingredients, like flour, which, tastes like dust, and sugar, which is much too sweet on its own, and eggs, which are gross, stir them together and make something as beautiful as a cake. To her, it's almost magical. And so she loves cooking. She wants to be a celebrity chef. She wants to release all of these famous books. But first, she's starting off with a little channel, Tammy Bakes. And she wants to be famous from that. But she only has like 7 views on each video. There's only really 2 people who seem to comment on her videos. And I think one of them's her little brother. So she's not succeeding at this, which is even more frustrating because at her school, there's 3 girls who are very successful at this whole online video YouTube game. There's Denise and her 2 friends Sheena and Maeve. They are the Circle Girls. They've got a very popular channel where they do all kinds of pranks and storytime and dances. and they are massively popular, to the point where they film all kinds of YouTube videos at school, and the teachers don't like it, but they also can't do much about it because they know they'll get so much backlash online, I guess, and also from the students at the school, because these girls are not only popular online, they're popular in real life as well. Tammy would kill for that kind of popularity, and she gets the chance when Denise approaches her during lunch, and even though she gets her name wrong, calls it a taffy cakes, she asks if Tammy will help them with a video they've got planned. Basically, she wants to film like the beginning and end of a relationship, and all the way through, with a boy from school. And the boy she's picked out is a kid called Jake Aberforth. She thinks she'll be perfect for this video series, but Denise tells Tammy that she's the only one that Jake will trust because he's the biggest fan of her YouTube channel. He leaves a lot of lovely comments, and in fact she shows a couple of screenshots of her channel and the comments left by Jake Aberforth 13, which is not great online security, but we'll ignore that for now. So Tammy still isn't sure, and she says, well, I don't even know this guy face to face, he's just a fan, right? But Denise insists, well, yeah, he's a fan, that means he'll do anything for you. So if you ask him, guaranteed he'll do the video for us. So Tammy agrees to meet them after school, and they'll set up this whole video. I guess she'll go ask him whatever. And that afternoon she meets Denise in the sports field rather than going to the buses, and she's confused that Maeve and Sheena aren't there, but Denise is just like, alright, follow me, and she just starts marching off, and so Tammy has to run after her to keep up, but she barely can. In fact, Denise then goes into the dark woods behind the school, the creepy woods right behind their school, and Tammy hesitates, but she runs in after her, and she quickly loses her, and she can't see her in a little clearing inside, so she's looking left and right, and then she hears like strange voices, and then screams and a chainsaw, and our girl freaks out, thinking, oh no, they've killed Denise, this mad man has killed Denise, he's got a blood-covered chainsaw, and he's going to kill me. And it turns out that what she thought was a killer wielding a chainsaw was in fact Denise playing sounds on her phone. So first of all, no phone speaker is that good that you'd believe that it's a real chainsaw, but also, like, the reason our girl thought it was a blood-soaked chainsaw is she saw a flash of the red phone case on Denise's phone and thought it was blood. Which, you know, there's a scientific term for this, which is impossible. How could you see the phone but not the person holding the But what's perhaps even more unbelievable is after Denise does this, sort of chuckling to herself, she says, sorry, I couldn't help myself. Now, let's go to Jake's cabin. And then Tammy just follows her, not clicking onto the fact that she's obviously being made fun of and pranked already. So then when they go to some creepy old cabin, which has like rusty signs hanging off and all this stuff, and also is covered in stupid, like, Party City Halloween decorations. So Denise asks Tammy to go inside and talk to Jake, and she does. And then, wow, who would have guessed it, she goes inside, and they slam the door behind her, and then she freaks out. Now, one of the things you'll learn when it comes to horror is that you can make just about anything scary. Even when our girl knows that it's a fake cabin that she's been shut into that's just got stupid Halloween decorations, it's really dark, she's trapped alone, she doesn't know how to get out, the door seems locked, that could be scary. But rather than get into her head and try to make us feel what she's feeling, the way this book attempts to make the reader understand her fear is by having Denise scream. But all of the screams, they are over 20 letters long of her just going, ah, and blah. In fact, one of them, I'll read this verbatim, this is how it's written in the story. People don't scream like this, especially when scared. And I've said before, and I will say again, that you just need to understand your main character. I just need to understand them. But I already cannot understand this. I don't understand why she fell for this as hard as she did. Like, it started off very believable, but then it quickly jumped off the edge of normalcy, and I do not understand why she's as scared as she is. I don't understand how anyone screams the way she does. And there's even more about a character, but I will get to that after this scene. So, a girl screams, and then she hears outside, she hears some giggling, and she hears some like clinking of bracelets and swishing of hair, and she quickly realizes, oh, those are all the telltale signs of the Circle Girls. So she realizes that she's been made fun of, and she's very angry, and she wants to get revenge, and then she finds in the cabin a strange book. That's when the sugary smell wafted in. My nose crinkled. I looked again at the cabin, squinting at the domed platters and dusty glass shelves. Were there items still in them? I leaned closer. Yes, name and price tags, Some stale-looking crumbs. My heart fluttered. A bakery? Was I trapped inside of a bakery? I reached toward a shelf. My hand bumped something solid, a narrow black book. The cabin walls thumped all around me. The circle girls were still laughing their heads off. I couldn't wait to turn the tables and scare them. But first, I dragged the book off the shelf and examined it. I still don't know why. Curiosity? Oil dripped down the spine as I stared at it. The Book of Lost Foods. I held my breath as I opened it. There were very few pages. Each page was ink black with pale writing I couldn't decipher. The text seemed to slither and change as my brain fought to read it. The only legible words were up top. Chiller cookies, the first grand dessert. A cookbook? I said. A Halloween cookbook? Close enough, a voice echoed behind me. I whipped around. Who's there? When no one spoke, I put my hand on my heart, calming down. A recording. Another stupid recording. I'm going to kill Denise when I see her, I grumbled. Sounds like a plan. Want some help? A light flickered. Something moved in the shadows. A person. A boy. Climbing out of the rotted wood wall. Hey, stranger, said the voice. Nice to meet you. I'm Jake. So, Tammy quite likes Jake, mostly because he's a cute boy with pretty blue eyes. And they talk a bit. He talks about how much he likes baking. And he says that he would really love it if someone would help him finish his mum's recipes, the ones in this book. So he asks Tammy to make the vow to complete all of the grand desserts. And she does. That's how the book says it. It just says that he says some words, she repeats them, and then afterwards he's a lot more relaxed. And then he seems to disappear. And when he does, she hears voices, and then there's a burst through the wall, and 3 masked figures come jumping in. I mean, the book pretends that they're real monsters for sort of a chapter scare, but it's obviously just the circle girls, and so they go oogly boogly boo, they scare Tammy again, and they talk about the fact that they filmed it all, and then they head off in a limousine, because these girls are also rich, apparently. But yeah, the scene ends with a limousine coming up, they all hop in, and they drive off, and Tammy is embarrassed knowing that she's going to be made fun of, I guess. Now, before we move on, I want to explain just how much I hate this main character. Because, first of all, yeah, she's quite silly, she's falling for these stupid pranks, that's fine, that could even work for this kind of a story. But what doesn't work is that her main motivation seems to be, she wants to be a celebrity chef, she wants to be famous for it, she loves baking beautiful cakes. But here's the thing, the key word there is beautiful. She herself even says, at the start of the book, that it doesn't matter what she puts in these cakes. They can be disgusting. In fact, she's often made ones with vinegar and soy sauce and all kinds of things. But because she's making it for video, so long as they look pretty on the camera, that's all that matters. Heck, she says even that when she becomes famous enough to sell her own cookbooks, it doesn't matter that the food is disgusting, because so long as she's a celebrity and tells people that it's good, they'll believe her. Which I hate for 2 reasons. First of all, makes me hate this character. Means she doesn't have any actual passion and care for what she's doing. But secondly, the whole premise of this book is that it's the horrors of putting something disgusting in your food, having to hunt down that strange ingredient. But no matter what it is, she's already making disgusting food. In fact, her family makes fun of the fact that she makes quote-unquote sour brownies. So if anything, perhaps adding slugs might be an improvement. But she's not the only one. I hate all of these characters. I hate the Circle Girls, but the reason I hate them isn't because they're hateable characters. No, the whole evil popular girl, that's fine, that's a common trope. What I don't like is that it's not believable because they are literally so rich that they buy, in the span of this book, 2 different stretch limousines. She buys a stretch Hummer and then a stretch Jeep because she gets sick of the first one. And it's even gold-plated on the inside. They go to their house, which has a mansion and guest rooms and all kinds of things. And it's ridiculous to the point that I don't really believe. This feels like the kind of thing in cartoons that you see with rich characters. So rich they have gold, stretch, limousine, Humvee stuff. It's just stupid. It doesn't make this book scary. It makes it less real. But even worse is her family, right? Because we're about to see them in the next scene. And everyone in her family, except maybe the dad, but still, are crazy. And again, not in a fun, realistic crazy, in a cartoon logic crazy. So her brother, when we first meet him, is acting like a dog. And it's a really stupid character quirk that he acts like a dog for a lot. He stops doing it halfway through the book, but I think that's mostly because the author forgot. Also, Tammy's mother supports her baking channel ideas, despite the fact that she often feeds the food to the family, and like I said, they make fun of the fact that it tastes gross. but she still supports her, using the family kitchen to cook this stuff and to make her videos, even though she's obviously terrible at it. And I'm not saying that she shouldn't support her girl's creative endeavors. I'm saying she should support her in becoming a good chef as well as just wanting to be a celebrity, because, well, I mean, not only do I think that that matters, but it's also kind of what the book is leading into in the end. But that's definitely jumping to the end in spoilers. But also, the mother has this ridiculous quirk. And I say quirk because it's not an interesting character trait. It's just that she constantly refers to Tammy as a weather event. Right? And it's not like she's a meteorologist or a weather person or whatever. Her mum is some IT specialist. Both of her parents work in IT and they work at the same company apparently. But when we first meet Tammy, from her mum's perspective, she says, "Oh, it's Hurricane Tammy." Like, okay, it's like, that's an interesting nickname, but that's not a nickname. She just always refers to her as a weather event. She always says, like, "Oh, there's a storm coming," or she says, "Oh, I don't see a rainbow here today." Or the worst one, there's a scene later in the book where she gets a nosebleed, and her mum says, "Oh, looks like it's raining." Does raining mean you're bleeding now? What? This is not a fun character quirk. It's annoying because I have to figure out what the heck she's referring to and what the weather event is meant to represent from her perspective. Why is she doing this? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add to the story. It detracts because I have to keep going. Wait. So I thought she was Hurricane Tammy. Now she's Tornado Tammy. Now she's Stormin' Tammy. What is going on? It's not even like Tammy is particularly wild or crazy, because like that's why you call a kid Hurricane Tammy, right? Because they're a bit of a wild one, but she's not wild. She just cooks bad food and doesn't have many friends. Now, you may have noticed that I'm not actually summarizing this book, and that's because we're going to skip ahead. Because there's the only stuff you need to know is that she finds online that she's getting harassed because they made fun of her in the video, they even stretched her face, and because Jake is a ghost, he's not in the video, a girl thinks they edited him out. They obviously didn't, it's because he's a ghost. And then our girl decides to bake the cookies to get revenge on the girls, and she even gets lucky because they ask her to help out with some other prank thing they're going to do for Halloween, and she knows it's going to be a prank on her, but they insist, "No, we want more help with this interview thing we're doing," and so she gets the opportunity to feed them those cookies. And the thing is, the reason why I'm skipping over all this stuff and it's so boring is because this book starts in medias res. Now, I have a little rant about this, okay? See, there's many different ways you can do in medias res, starting your story in the middle of things. One of them is the "how did we get here" scene. So you start from a scene that's right in the third act, right near the end of the story, and that makes people intrigued because, like, oh, that's so weird. What could produce this scene, right? That could be interesting. It's really well done, especially in noir stories and mysteries, but it can be done very poorly. Another way you can do it is one that I'm quite fond of. I call it the beheaded story. You just take the introductory elements of your story, your Act 1, throw it all in the bin, start from Act 2. So this means your story starts with action, starts with the things that are occurring in the story, and this is really useful, especially if you're able to get people to understand your character through action. If you don't need to use a lot of exposition, if there's not a lot of world building, you can start right from the ground running, and that can make a more intense story because of that. The third thing you can do, and it's something that this story does, is the restructured chronology, and in this case they're taking a scene from Act 2 and they're putting it at the start. This is really useful if your story is a slow burn. So, for instance, if your story has something like a slowly growing monster plant, or maybe your story needs a certain date, like maybe things happen on the full moon, then okay, it means the original parts of your story at the very beginning is going to be a little dull. So you take a scene from the middle, show how intense things are going to get, and that way, even during those slow moments, there's a whole lot of tension. It's pregnant with the possibility that this could be what leads to that horrendous scene. But the problem is, this story isn't a slow burn, because the very first scene, after we introduce this whole revenge scene, is her getting pranked in a strange haunted cabin in the woods and then finding a magical book of recipes. Unfortunately, I don't think it's very well written, but the idea is there, the tension is already there. But what's worse is that all of the tension that comes from this scene is that she's doing something horrendous. She's putting slugs into cookies. That's a horrendous thing and an evil thing to do. Even she herself says it. And so we're thinking, why would she do that? And then in chapter 3, we learn, oh yeah, she did that to get revenge because they pranked her. And despite knowing that, it's not until chapter 17 that we get back to the scene where she actually puts the slugs into the cookies. Why? What happens in the intervening time? Well, she gets the book to her house because a pizza guy delivers it, because he says that it's something he was told to do by some girls, but he wasn't. It turns out that it's the ghost. And then our girl decides to bake the cookies, but she doesn't know where to get slugs. So she goes to the pet store and asks about getting some slugs, but he says they only sell crickets. So she buys some crickets and she takes them home. But when she goes to take off the lid, she sees all the crickets are dead, and she decides not to make the cookies with the dead crickets, even though she's going to have to kill the slugs. Are you bored? Are you bored listening to me rattle off all this nonsense? Because I was bored reading it. This book is 100% one of what I call the table sitters. It is not a book that I wanted to keep picking up. It took me 3 days to read this just because I felt it such a slog to read through these boring scenes that weren't developing the story until finally, we get to the scene and it skips over it because we already read the scene earlier in chapter 1. And then she gets picked up in a limousine, she goes to the house, and the driver drives like crazy, and it's partially for a chapter scare, partially to show that Denise is still pranking her because, she's obviously screaming in the back seat. But they get to her place, like, all right, come on, Tammy, and we'll get ready for the evening and interviews. And Tammy has the box of cookies, and so she's really keen to give the cookies to the girls, but they're all like, no, we got some other stuff to do. There's a brief moment where she meets, I think they're actually at Sheena's house, so they meet Sheena's mum, and she's wearing a shirt that says Clarice's Kitchen, and she's talking about how she's a huge fan of the old chef Clarice Aberforth, and she really wants to try these cookies. And look, it does help get the idea across that the cookbook is actually from a real person, like it's not a prop like our girl originally thought, it was just a Halloween prop. But I have to say, a story which seems rather focused on YouTubers who want to be popular, the fact that they learn about the reality of this cookbook and this old celebrity chef via Excited Mothering t-shirt and not by, Googling it, I gotta say, rings a little hollow. Now, there's another brief moment. So they go to Sheena's guest house. I mean, it is the guest house, she just calls it her house, where they've got all of the setup for all of their filming location, where they actually have like their logo in the background, and they're getting ready for an interview later with her. But as they're waiting, there's a blackout, and for some reason, even though there's a blackout, there's like a screensaver thing on the screen that starts moving around, and it's a slideshow of all the newsreels that talk about the tragedy where Chef Clarice and her son Jake died. Because this was the whole plan for their prank. Because they've got her on camera talking to Jake, a ghost. They've been sort of telling everyone, we scared her so much that she was seeing ghosts, so they were going to interview her and try to get her to admit on camera that she saw a ghost, and then make fun of her for it, I guess. And so even though to me it's been obvious since the very first time we met Jake, but now finally our girl understands that he's a ghost, okay? But then this scene gets interrupted because Sheena's mum comes in with the Tupperware container full of cookies that Tammy made, and she insists that everyone try them because she is obsessed with them. And even though Tammy's a bit grossed out by the fact that she knows there's slugs in them and she wasn't intending for the mum to eat them, she shares them around, and all the girls are in love with these cookies. And in fact, once they eat them, they then fall under Tammy's spell and start doing everything she tells them. Okay, I have to say in praise of this story that thematically, conceptually, this is really clever, because our girl wants to be a celebrity chef, and so the idea that she's using this magic to become more powerful, and the way that she gets more powerful is by creating people who follow her, and so basically she has fans in a way that makes a lot of thematic sense. I like that. What I don't like is the execution, because the way it works in this story is that when someone eats her cookies, they're basically mind controlled, hypnotized. If she says bark like a dog, they'll bark like a dog. If she says punch yourself in the face, stab yourself, they will do it. And the problem with that is that I already don't like this character. But as soon as she realizes that she has magic mind control slavery cookies, she gets her slaves to get more slugs, and then she gets all the ingredients, she makes them again, and feeds them to her family with the knowledge that they will then be enslaved. That's going to be a yikes from me, dog. But then, once her family eats the cookies, instead of being enamored with them like everyone else, they all say, this don't taste right, and then they all are violently ill. This is important for two reasons. One, we learn that you can't make the same recipe twice, it doesn't work the second time. And two, her mum bans her from the kitchen. But the problem with her mum banning her from the kitchen is that our girl has access to another kitchen, a dream kitchen. Because one of the plot points in this book is that when our girl goes to sleep, sometimes she goes to this magical, beautiful kitchen with spotless pale tiles and walls, which is occupied by an impossibly thin, ghostly female chef and a hideously deformed mummy chef. And now, this isn't the first time we see them. They are introduced earlier in the bit of the summary that I sort of skipped, but it just seemed like a nightmare at that point. Our girl didn't know it was real, but we start to learn that this is definitely real, because when she cooks in that kitchen, the stuff she makes is real, it's really there. And so she realizes she can use the dream kitchen. But also, it sort of uses it for a little bit of exposition and also a little bit of creep out, because the Grigory, the weird mummy thing is really creepy. And also the chef, we also learn that Chef Clarissa is definitely the Clarisse. Is it Clarissa? Doesn't matter. What matters is that she's obviously the same woman who is Jake's mum and who was the celebrity chef who died. And I don't like this for two reasons. One is because she only really is there for the sake of exposition, which we don't need, because I thought the fact that her family was violently ill was enough of a hint that the recipe doesn't work twice. But secondly, having a creepy ghost woman and a mummy chef in her dreams just feels really Disney Channel original movie, if you know what I mean. Like, it feels good. It feels like theme park style, kooky, creepy. And of course, there's the fact that this book is so cluttered with weird little kooky ideas that you literally lose the plot amongst all of this mess. But that'll become more obvious as we get further through the summary, so let's keep going. So back to the story. Our girl's enjoying having her 3 little slave girls running around. She fails miserably to get her family to eat the slug cookies. That doesn't work. And she realizes she needs to make the next recipe, which is spider hole donut holes or something. And she's thinking about making them for the Halloween bake-off that's going to be happening later on. And there's also a hint that there's going to be a celebrity chef there. And don't get too excited. I thought that this was going to be leading up to the idea that Chef Clarice was going to come back to life and she would be the celebrity chef. But no, it's just some random dude. But what matters is that our girl is getting ready to make the spider donuts for that. But she suddenly gets so popular because she's hanging out with the Circle Girls that a bunch of kids are like, hey, how about you make some stuff for my birthday that's tomorrow? And she decides, you know what, okay, fine, I'll make you something. And she decides to make the spider donuts. But she doesn't exactly know how she's going to get the spiders, because the recipe asks for 3 ounces of spider guts. And so she asks the teacher, and he says, well, 3 ounces is about 85 grams. And since a spider weighs less than a gram, you'd easily need hundreds of spiders. And so our girl gets some of her slaves, which now includes her brother, because he ate one of the cookies when he wasn't supposed to. So she gets the Circle Girls and her brother to go getting spiders in the woods, and they manage to fill, and I'm talking like fill to the point that these shopping bags, clear shopping bags, are black with how many spiders are in them. She gets them to fill them with spiders, and so she takes the bag, with the tied top, and she gets ready to stomp on it. And I need to first tell you that Tammy's brother, who is called Pete, by the way, has a pet tarantula. Now, the reason I didn't mention that earlier is because the book didn't. They mentioned this like a chapter or 2 earlier. And despite being one of her, mind-controlled slaves, when he sees that she's about to stomp on this bag full of spiders, he screams, "Don't kill them," grabs the bag, opens it, and then pours them on his sister's head. Now, ignoring the fact that this kid is described as being younger and shorter, so I don't know how he reached up that high, but even if he wanted to save the spiders, why would the way you do that be pouring them onto someone else, knowing that they're going to freak out and slap them and stomp it? And when I'm reeling from this, trying to understand why he'd do that, our girl's response is that she decides to use his pet tarantula in the recipe. Okay. I didn't think we'd be doing this again, but this is the second time in the first season, might I add, of Chapter Spooks, wherein a pet tarantula has been killed and the main character has been in a positive mood about it. The first one was in Little Pet Shop of Horrors, and now in this book, our girl decides that because her brother poured spiders on her, which is completely out of character, doesn't make any sense to me, but that's a horrible thing to do, but she decides the best revenge is to kill his pet tarantula. The book tries to soften the blow. It says that she asked Grigory to get the spider for her and kill it, but that doesn't change the fact that she is responsible for the death of this boy's pet. Once again, that's going to be a yikes from me, dog. As I said earlier, it took me 3 days to get through this book, and one of the reasons was that when I read that, I put the book down and I didn't pick it up until the next day, because I found this main character so despicable. So you know what, if you're enjoying this, please go ahead and rate this on whatever scoring system they have for podcasts, because I suffer for this podcast, and I hope you appreciate it. So, okay, so what happens next is that our girl goes to school, and she gets out the donut hole with the spiders in them, and when people start eating them, they go nuts for them. In fact, Denise actually, it says, hip checks her, bumps her to make her spill the balls, and then everyone goes diving for them to eat them off the ground. They taste that good. But also, the fact that her brother reacted the way he did, and also the fact that Denise, deliberately sabotaged her, shows that the servant, mind control thing is wearing off. In fact, Chef Clarisse calls it her servant spell, which also means that the recipes don't do anything different. Each one does the exact same effect, which is it makes people become your slaves. And she has to keep doing it, keep refeeding it to people in order to make sure the spell is more fresh. Which, again, I don't really like the execution of the characters, but that also makes sense thematically, because even as the girl herself says, it's just like when you're uploading stuff like videos online. You need to keep updating, otherwise you lose popularity. But now, lots and lots of kids at school are eating these things, and in fact some of the teachers have even eaten some of them, and so she's got like the whole school under her thumb now. And so she's interested in making the third recipe, but she balks when she realizes that the final ingredient of this recipe is 2 teaspoons of human blood. And Tammy thinks that this is probably going too far, because the idea of eating human blood, she thinks that's really dangerous to do. And, I don't know if that's more dangerous than eating slugs. You know what, we'll talk more about that at the end, but what matters is that it's also really difficult to get your hands on human blood unless you're going to cut an injure yourself. So she considers doing it to herself, but she's scared of the idea. And she thinks, it's going to be a lot easier if I just get one of my slaves to do it. So she gets her little brother, and she asks him to use a pen to puncture his skin. And because he's literally eaten a donut hole that morning, he gets out a pen and he starts pressing it into his skin. But watching him do this slowly but surely, she freaks out. She says, no, please stop. And so he lifts the pen before it actually breaks through his skin. And Tammy decides that this is way too far. She doesn't want to do any of this stuff anymore. So when she goes to sleep that night, she's in the dream kitchen, and she tells Chef Clarisse that she's not going to do this. She can't get blood from people. And so that's when Chef Clarisse threatens her. She gets Gregory to approach her holding a great knife. And in fact, he's holding it above her, but he doesn't actually cut her. He gives her the knife. And then Chef Clarisse says to her, "Sink the blade into your arm, Tammy." And Tammy is horrified, watching as the blade turns around and starts pressing deep into her skin. But this is all a fake out. Clarisse just starts laughing at her and says, "You see, it's not so hard to get people to do things for you. You've got the spell of the servant spell. I've got my vow over you." But our girl refuses, and so the next day when she wakes up, she sees that she has a wart, a horrendous green wart, growing on her forehead. And the idea is that every time that she fails to fulfill the recipe, because of the vow, something horrendous will happen to her, like these horrible warts. But our girl still doesn't want to do it. She's refusing. In fact, she decides to try drinking coffee to stay awake, because we got sort of like a Freddy Krueger situation with the dream kitchen. But she tries to drink coffee, and she immediately vomits because it's horrendously bitter and cold. And when her mum sees this, she immediately takes her to the hospital for a blood test, because that's what you do, I guess. And when the nurse takes her blood, she realizes that, it's ironic that she needs blood for this recipe, but it's so easily taken from her. But then she faints, which, makes sense. A lot of people faint when they get their blood taken. It can be potentially dangerous, but luckily she comes to when she gets home, and she sees that she's got a bandage on her arm, and she thinks, "Oh, I know, I'll get some blood from my needle wound." And so she runs to the bathroom to do that, but of course it doesn't work, because by the car ride home, it's not bleeding anymore, and she can't, squeeze it to get any more blood out. I don't know, I guess it's just the fact that she calls it a needle wound and not, like a small needle puncture, a jab. And so our girl is sort of in two minds. She doesn't want to do this recipe, she doesn't want to go to the dream kitchen, but she also knows that if she doesn't, she'll get worse and worse every day, so she's trying to think of ways to get this. And that night, she manages to fall asleep. And she wakes up in a start, worried that she's in the dream kitchen, but instead, she gets approached by Jake Aberforth's ghost. And now she knows for a fact that he's a ghost, and she's a little bit scared, but she also, again, she thinks he's kind of cute. And so she's talking to him, and he says, look, I'm sorry that I gave you the book. My mum forced me to give it to you because she's got power over me. I don't have that much power, but maybe I can help you. You know, I don't have much power in this world, but I do have enough power over her that maybe I can help stop her. But the only way that you'll be able to stop her is if you get the ingredient for the next recipe, but don't use it. So get the blood, but then keep it from her. That's how you stop her. So Tammy says, you know what? Yes, I'll work with you. We'll stop your mother. But then suddenly they hear thumping, and Jake screams, "Oh no, they found us!" And then Grigory appears and grabs her and drags her to the dream kitchen. Like she gets dragged into the dream, and there's a weird. I think she says like, "Oh, it's like teleporting," which is weird because it also seems to be implied that it's part of her because she's in the dream kitchen, and then she says, "I'm not giving you any blood," and they start attacking her and chasing her, and she manages to escape because she hears the alarm on her phone blaring because she set up several alarms to keep her awake, and the blaring is enough to make Gregory start to fade, and that's how she then jumps back through the portal. Which doesn't make a lot of sense because later on we'll learn that the kitchen she's going to, the weird dream kitchen, is actually in the cabin from earlier. It's like down the stairs in that cabin sort of bakery thing, which I also find weird because I also assumed that the dream kitchen was just her using her regular kitchen, because in the scene where she was making the donut balls, there was a brief moment, it's not really huge, but where the next morning her dad sees that the stove has been left on and he wonders why, and I thought maybe that she was just sleepwalking using the regular kitchen in her dreams, but apparently that's not what was going on. It's actually, you see what I mean when I said earlier that this book is just so cluttered with different ideas? But it doesn't make the story more interesting, it just makes it more confusing, because all of this scene has led up to, besides her befriending Jake, is that when she stumbles through the portal, she then staggers into her house at speed, and she goes slamming into the front door so hard that she gives herself a bloody nose. And her mum tries to help and gets her a tissue and tells her that if she's not careful, she'll keep bleeding. But that's enough for her to realize, wait, keep bleeding? Oh no, I need this blood. So she gets a jar and she gets a teaspoon and she uses the teaspoon to get enough blood from her nose and puts it in the jar. So that night, because she's so tired from everything she's gone through, she falls asleep. But luckily this time she doesn't go to the dream kitchen. Instead, she goes to a dark void where she meets Jake Aberforth once again. "What's going on?" I stammered. "Where am I?" I looked around and saw an eerie blank space where my bedroom door should be. Jake strolled through the gap, as if nothing was strange. Did the spell break?" I said. "Is this still my house? Am I dead?" A broad grin appeared on Jake's face as he slowly approached me. "No, my nightstand." He reached for the blood jar I'd left by the clock. "She did it," he whispered. "She actually did it." Grinning widely, he snatched it. What followed was the craziest, loveliest, most impossible night I could ever imagine. What even happened? I remember it only in flashes, showing my Tammy Bakes channel to Jake, giggling insanely for almost no reason before stepping into that eerie blank space. Where did that lead to? All I remember is Jake, his sharp grin, the icy chill of his palm gripped in mine, the crisp forest reek as we endlessly walked, until we reached a log cabin as bright as the moon. "This is my home," Jake announced. "How it was. How it will be again." Still grinning, he led me inside. Clarice's kitchen, said a crisp metal sign on the door. The sweet smell of food pricked my nostrils. "This way, Tam. Almost there." We walked past a row of shining glass shelves, without cobwebs, down an aisle of sweets, each in fancy domed platters, toward a strange-looking gap in the wall. A staircase. I remember thinking to myself, haven't I seen this staircase before? Jake paused in front of it, grinning like a stoplight. "Just a few more steps, Tam." Steam from below slammed in my nostrils. A warm fragrance flooded into my bones, like a web, like a wonderful web. I didn't hesitate. I followed Jake down the creaky wood steps. A smell flooded her bones like a web. Yeah, I'm not getting it either. But what matters is that they then cook something together, because Tammy does love baking, and they're making a cake together, like a red velvet cake, and she wakes up and she just enjoys that she had this wonderful dream. But the next day at school, everyone's excited to try this cake because apparently on her Tammy Bakes channel, she put out a comment saying, "Oh, and for the Halloween thing, I've got a preview of some of the baked goods that we'll be enjoying on the day." And so she goes and sees that someone has brought a cake that everyone says that she made. But when she looks at it, she realizes that it's not actually a red velvet cake like she'd thought. It is definitely the blood cake from the recipe book. She tries to stop them from eating it, but by the time she gets there, there's only one thin slice left, so she grabs it and ends up throwing it in the bin, but everyone is obsessed with her. In fact, that afternoon, she has to go to a baseball game with her little brother, but every time she calls to her little brother like, "Oh, go Pete, go," he tries to jump the fence and run away. Or when she says, "Look alive out there," he starts moving and wiggling crazy to show that he's completely full of life. And at the end of the game, every single player approaches her to give her like the game bat, game ball, some of their game helmet, their equipment, because they've become fanatics to the point of obsession. And that night when she goes to her room, before she falls asleep, she sees Jake Aberforth in her room once again. And apparently Tammy didn't realize that he was the one who helped her make the cakes. Obviously he's evil, but so she's surprised when he explains, "Yes, I'm here now because I've gained more power because you've made the third recipe, as we discussed. I was just trying to give you some inspiration to keep fulfilling the vow, and now you're under my servant spell, so you're going to come with me." So he gets her to grab the recipe book, start heading for the cabin. And the whole while she's like, "Well, how can you work for those people? How can you? That they're evil." And he's like, "Well, but it's my mother, and yes, we know that these things seem evil. They are magic spells that we're doing. This isn't just baking, this is witchcraft." And also, I don't entirely understand the context, but he sort of explains that, "Oh, and by the way, Gregory is actually just me," because, and I mean, this is kind of interesting, but he explains that, so during the last recipe, something went wrong. That's why they didn't finish them. And it managed to separate him from his body. And so the Gregory, what's left, this horrendously injured mass covered in bandages, is the injured body from that accident, and he was separated from his body and there's now just the spirit. But he's taking her to the cabin because they're going to make the second last recipe. She's like, "Wait, don't you mean the last recipe?" He's like, "Oh yeah, the last recipe." So they look in the book and she sees the last recipe is ice cream with 13 mammalian eyeballs. And if I have to be honest, I gotta say I really like this for the final ingredient here, because not only is it really creepy, the idea of getting eyeballs, and to me that's a lot more gross and creepy than having to just get blood, but also she wants to be a celebrity chef and she has a YouTube channel. What's the whole thing about that is getting views, getting watch time. So I think it actually works thematically as well as for the whole physical conflict of it, the idea of having to get eyeballs from living creatures. But of course the book ruins it, because it ruins everything. So as they're going through the forest, she also sees 13 one-eyed squirrels, which she also did see earlier in the book. And Jake even says, "Oh yeah, they're from the last time we did this," which doesn't make any sense for two reasons. Number one, Jake says, "Don't worry, they can survive with one eye. I should know." And she realizes that Gregory, the mummy, he only ever has one eye, and she realizes that he must have donated one of his eyes, which doesn't make any sense because the recipe asks for 13 eyes, and there are 13 squirrels, and so if you had 13 squirrels in him, that would then be 14 eyes, which doesn't make any sense. But not only that, he says, "We used them before," but that would have to mean that they only died a few years ago, because squirrels can only live for like 4 years in the wild. Unless these are ghost squirrels or something. I mean, who knows? Who knows with this book? I mean, they just throw everything in there. And look, there is genuinely a creepy scene where she gets sort of ambushed by Denise, because Denise has been following her because she knows that everyone's sort of under her spell, and she faked eating the spider donut ball before because she knows that there's some sort of a trick about this. But when she runs in and Jake sees her, he grabs her and he ties her up, and he turns her over and tries to get Tammy to pull out her eyeball. And so he gives her a stick and he does the whole servant spell thing, saying, "All right, now you pick left or right." And come on, that's a creepy scene, her working with this stick, and just the idea of wrenching it into someone's eye socket and pulling out their eye. It's a gross concept, although Quick side note, like, I'm not going to go too far into this because it is kind of gross, but the reality is that you can't actually pull out someone's eyeball whole without a very specialized tool, because it turns out that the optic nerve is a lot thicker and bigger than what a simple stick would get, so the eyeball would likely not be whole if you tried to pull it out with a stick, but that's a little bit gross and getting into some weird side stuff, and I don't think this is relevant to the story, because what matters, back to the story, is that Tammy decides she can't do it. As much as she hates Denise, and as much as there has been a bit of a motif how every time we talk about Denise, she talks about her twinkling green eyes, and so this is sort of like coming back to that, she can't bring herself to cause that kind of a damage to another human being. You know, it's why she couldn't even get blood from her younger brother, so how could she possibly pull the eyeball out of another human being, even if it is this girl that she hates so much? And apparently this is enough for the servant spell to crack. I mean, they've used that term a few times, cracking the servant spell. And so Jake is shocked at this, thinking, no, but you're under the servant spell, you know, you should be like a dog on a leash. And she's like, oh no, but you're the real dog on a leash. And then she throws the recipe book away. Now, again, this is an example of a concept that I like, but I don't like the way it's executed, because she quickly then explains to the reader that she realized that Jake was bound to the book. She realized this because every time she's encountered Jake, the book has been there. She encountered him when she read it in the cabin, and when it was in her room when she was preparing for recipes, and it's also why he insisted on her carrying the book with them when they were heading to the cabin. And also, I mean, I didn't pay too much attention because there's so much happening in this book, but on two different occasions when he moved the cake to the school and when she found the book the first time, there were some torn bandages on it, which implied that they were being carried by Grigory, because that's his body and it does as it's told, whereas he's just the spirit and so he can't move without the book. And like I say, I like this concept because, as I've said several times before, I love it when the main characters are actively working to solve the puzzle, to try to find out the truth behind what they're doing. The reason I don't like this is, number one, she says all of this very quickly, you know, as she throws the book, and in fact she goes through this whole 2-page long explanation of all of the evidence for this, and then after the paragraph is over, the book is still flying through the air. So clearly this is meant to be all happening in her head, sort of expositing to the reader, when I thought it would have been more interesting if instead she'd done all of this thinking as she was walking to the cabin. Like, you could have saved the actual epiphany for when she's in the woods, because that would explain why she doesn't throw the book away earlier, but why does it all have to happen suddenly in this moment rather than have her thinking through it over time? And the second reason I don't like it is because this is a very minor point in this story which involves magic and weird teleporters and magic spell books and warts and curses, to only have figured out that the guy is tied to the book, and what she needs to be working out is how to break the spells. But anyway, she manages to throw the book away, and because he is tied to the book, it turns out, Jake gets whipped away from her as though, you know, like getting yanked by a chain, and disappears into the woods with the book. Tammy turns to look at Denise and sees that she's, you know, she managed to get out of the ties around her back and she's run off. And she can just hear Jake calling out pitifully from the woods, like, oh, please come, you know, we can give you anything you want, you'll be famous, you know, you'll have slaves, all this fun stuff. But Tammy decides to ignore it, and she walks back home. She does plan on eventually burying the book, but clearly he's got too much power, you know, from all the magic stuff she's been doing, so she wants to wait until he's weakened a bit before she goes back to find the book and burn it or bury it or something. And then eventually her powers start wearing off. You know, she's no longer popular, people stop viewing her channel so much, and people stop treating her like the queen that they thought she was when they'd eaten all her blood cake. Of course, the downside is that the curse is still active, because every single day that she's not been cooking, and it's 9 days now, she's gotten another wart on her face. And so her mother insists that even though she's been homesick, you know, claiming that she's, you know, got the cold or something, but really it's just her face, that she needs to go to the Halloween bake-off because she promised she would. And even though she's not a contestant anymore, she said she would, so they get ready to take her to the bake-off. And she decides to wear like a catcher's mask so that she, you know, doesn't get recognized with all the warts on her face. And there's a small fake-out scare when they see that the celebrity judge is some guy, I think they say he's J.B. Carcetti. If that's a reference to someone, I didn't recognize it, but he goes to eat some red velvet cake, which she recognizes is actually her blood cake, and so she freaks out and screams for him not to eat it, and she even takes off her mask and starts yelling, and people get freaked out seeing that her face is covered in warts. But the celebrity chef tries it and says, yes, quite good, but could use a little bit more sugar, that's a B+. And so obviously the spell must have worn off, because it's not even affecting him even though he ate it. And even though it's kind of gross that he ate human blood, our girl is then distracted because some of the circle girls come up to her, sort of taking a photo, with a horrible face. And then as she's dazzled by the camera flashes from these two girls, they then say, here, you'll feel better if you eat something, and they stuff some ice cream in her mouth. Because it turns out here's the twist, right? She eats this, and she's brought under the control of Denise, because as the epilogue that explains, when Denise disappeared that night, she didn't go running home, she went running after the book, because as much as they were saying that, she could turn into a witch and become powerful if she did all this stuff, she said, no, I'm not like that. But it turns out Tammy is like that, because in the 9 days, she did all 3 recipes, and then she did this final one with the ice cream, and she fed it to Tammy and has her under control. And so they're then heading to the cabin. And so Denise is dragging Tammy behind her, and they head to the cabin, and they say that they're going to do the final recipe. Remember how there was that hint how he said second last recipe? So they go there for the final recipe, which has one important ingredient. It requires a sacrifice, a witch. So they drag her down the stairs to the cabin, to the kitchen, where the mummy and the Chef Clarice are waiting, and Chef Clarice turns to Denise and says, you've done very well, child. Now we have the final ingredient. She turns to Gregory and she says, grab her. And then Gregory grabs Denise. And she's screaming, saying, what are you doing? No, I brought you Tammy. And they're saying, yes, you did bring us Tammy, but she wasn't a good enough witch. We need a real witch, and you're the only real witch here. And then as she's pleading for help, they freeze her stiff, and they fill her with icing, and they stuff her into the bowl to make soul sorbet, the final dessert. This finally reunites Jake with his buddy Gregory, and he becomes a real boy once again, and the story ends with Chef Clarice feeding the soul sorbet to Tammy. The end. So what can I say about this book? Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is I hate it. I hate it so much. I did not enjoy this book whatsoever. I mean, like I said, there are some ideas, there are some concepts here that were really interesting and that you could have played with them in an interesting way. But this book, flat out, doesn't. It has really, really unlikable characters, unrealistic characters that feel like they belong in a cartoon and not in a kid's book. It has ridiculous plot lines that seem overly convoluted, whilst at the same time don't seem to achieve anything. It's a whole lot of noise, but not a lot of sound. I genuinely don't understand why this book is 200 pages, because so much of it just feels like treading water. Like, the fact that she goes to cook the first recipe and it takes her 60 pages to do it is because she keeps trying and failing. She tries it this time and then she accidentally sets the oven on fire. Or she tries this time and she's got crickets that died. She decides not to do it even though she was going to kill the bugs anyway, which I'd argue it would be worse to die in a fire than suffocation. Then again, I haven't actually died before, so I can't really say that with authority. But my point is that none of this makes sense. But I could so easily see this being a good story. Like, if you simplified it, and you also changed it so that the structure made more sense with the building of the tension and everything. So, like, here's how I would do this. So first things first, you don't need in medias res, because we're going to have this already from the start. Introduce our girl, say that she loves baking and she really likes cooking, but the problem is that, she can't really get other people to eat her food, and she doesn't have that many friends, so the only people who eat her food is her family, and maybe once or twice on her channel, maybe she made a mistake in a recipe and people made fun of her. See, this is the thing that I think this book is missing, is why she gets targeted, and the first thing that comes to my mind is what trolls online call a lol cow. Someone who is easily reactive, someone that they make fun of because the way they react is very funny. So maybe someone realizes when she makes a mistake in a recipe that she gets really, really upset about it because she says, look, I didn't mean to make the mistake, I was really trying. And so that's why she gets targeted by the Circle Girls. And so that would explain maybe what they decide to do for their prank on her, rather than this whole Jake Aberforth thing, because that's ridiculous. They instead say, hey, there's an old bakery out here, an old haunted bakery, and so we want you to bring some cakes for this, because that's the idea, is that we're sort of doing like a sort of mixed seance recipe. I don't know, it doesn't matter. What matters is that they decide to go to this old creepy bakery and they want her to bring some cakes, because it'll be like, oh, maybe it's like an offering, like a seance thing. And so she goes with a cake that she makes. It's a really nice cake. She puts a lot of effort into it. But when they get to the cabin, the girls, they do their fake seance thing, and they hear a voice booming that says, oh, well, you shouldn't be here. In fact, you should eat the cake. And I was thinking, see, in my head, one of the girls says that she can't because she's diabetic. One girl says she can't because she's celiac or, wheat intolerant. And the other girl says that she's allergic to eggs. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they force Tammy to then force the cake into her face. And so she ends up having to eat the whole cake in like under a minute. And she does it so quickly that she's sick on camera. And then they reveal afterwards that they're all burst out laughing, and they say they got her good. And they make fun of her, saying, oh, look, she puked. She hates her own cooking. And so then she becomes this target of ridicule. And I like that more, because then it also ties into the whole baking thing instead of the weird, scary, weird cabin with Halloween decor. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But then when the girls leave and she's feeling, sick and gross at herself, and she's like crying in the corner because they were making fun of her, that's when she hears the whole Jake Aberforth voice. And a boy comes into the cabin, and he then offers her the recipe book, and he says that they shouldn't have come in there because the cabin belongs to him and his family. It's an abandoned old bakery, and our girl is enamored with him. And so when he says, here, take this book, but if you're going to take the book, you have to promise that you will bake everything in it, sort of does the vow then and there. And so then she agrees because, cute boy. And then when she gets home, she decides not to, because the first recipe is something gross. Now, personally, I don't like the slugs thing, because I think that's gross for the sake of being gross. I'd prefer something that does like a sympathetic magic concept. Now, it's not necessary, but personally, I would have the first recipe use dog hair as the final ingredient, because that's gross, but that's not too unseemly, it's just a horrible texture. And then the second recipe could be spiders. See, my idea is that the first recipe is dog hair because, dogs, pets, dogs do as they're told. And then spiders, you have the web connection, and that's the idea, is that it's controlling people's minds, connecting their minds in sort of a web. And the third recipe could still be blood, because that's sort of like a blood pack thing. And the fourth one could be eyeballs, because of the whole viewership and having your eye on you and fans watching you thing. So I think that'll make sense there. But so the first recipe is the dog hair, and she doesn't want to do it. But then she gets home and she starts receiving all of the online hatred. It's then that she realizes that she is the laughingstock of the school. When she goes to school, people start making fun of her, saying, wow, have you brought your own lunch? Maybe you should eat from the cafeteria. We don't want you vomiting again. Everyone's making fun of her. And so she decides that she needs to get her revenge. And personally, this is one thing I think is missing from this story, is the reality that people don't like bullies. Like, if someone is a, quote-unquote lol cow, and people are really popular, I can understand, but maybe the girls say, look, we're getting a little bit of backlash. Not most comments, but some comments are saying that we're being rude. And in fact, someone even tried to report our video for bullying. And so they decide, in order to keep the video up, that they approach Tammy and say, hey, look, we want to have you in another video. And their idea is that they're still going to prank her, but it's not going to be as cruel to make her vomit and stuff like that. And Tammy decides, okay, and I'll bring my cookies or muffins. For some reason, I feel like muffins makes more sense for dog hair. Don't ask me why. But so she brings that, and then the girls eat it, and then they fall under her spell. But instead of it being this servitude, servanty thing, I'd prefer it if it was just they love it so much that they're like, wow, what can we do to eat more of your cooking? Like, we'll do anything to sort of be close to you, be your friends, keep more cooking. And so then to me, that would make more sense as the story builds. So then she decides to try the recipe again. So she tries the recipe again, feeds it to someone else, and they feel sick. Maybe one person vomits because they get some hair caught in their throat. And that's when she realizes that the recipe won't work twice. And you can even add the idea that she hears a voice in her head saying, you can't cook the same thing twice. And so she decides to cook the next thing, which is with the spiders. And of course she thinks it's gross, but she tries it anyway. And she gives it out at school. And then everyone who eats the balls then becomes a huge fan of hers, and she says, you can see more of me on Tammy Bake's channel, so they start watching her channel. She's getting lots of comments, she's getting really popular, and she's happy with it. And in fact, she sees the next recipe that it uses human blood, but she doesn't want to do that one. That one seems a bit too far. But that's when she sees Jake Aberforth in her room. He's still see-through, he's still a ghost, but he says, you need to keep going. And she asks him why, and he explains that because he is a ghost and it's fulfilling these recipes that's giving him more power. And in fact, she could even bring back his mother. And I like the idea of, instead of having the stupid dream kitchen, he would then take her back to the cabin/bakery and into the kitchen downstairs, where he'd show her that his mother is this faded, ghastly figure, perhaps this skeletal skeleton, and there's this gory creature, this chef that is severely badly burnt in all of this. And he says that he wants her to fulfill the recipe so that he can bring his mother back, bring his family back together. And I like that more, because then it's the idea, instead of her being controlled and cheated into doing it, she's actually being enamored by this boy, and she wants to help him, even though it requires her to use a blood sacrifice. And she does that one, and I like the idea of then she gets even more people become crazed about her, to the point that people are starting to harass her. Like, not only are they clawing at her at school, trying to get her autograph and stuff, but they find out where she lives. Someone doxes her, and so they start coming to her house, at all hours of the day, all hours of the night, just trying to get some food from her, getting her to cook. And so she's starting to get, inundated with all of these fans. And she doesn't want to do the last recipe, and especially when she sees that it has eyeballs in it, she says to Jake, no, absolutely not. I'm not doing this last recipe. That is too far. I'm not going to go blinding animals to do this. And then you can throw in that line of him saying, well, you don't necessarily have to blind them. You only need one eye from each animal. And trust me, pigs can live with only one eye. And that would be a hint that he's actually, partly the spirit body thing of the Gregory thing. But she refuses, and so then he says, okay, that's okay. And then, in my head, the idea is that he would then ask her to have lunch with him or something. Like, I know this doesn't fully fit, but the idea is that he would give her something that she doesn't realize that he made, and so she'll eat it and she'll really love it, and then she'll look inside and she'll see that there's something gross inside, and we'll get this interesting moment of her realizing it's got something horrific inside, but she'll still keep eating it because it tastes so good, because she's now under his control and she wants to do anything to eat and more. And so he asks her to follow him into the cabin, and so they go down towards that creepy kitchen. And then I'm fine with the ending being very similar, although I don't like the whole soul sorbet. I mean, partially because you don't actually bake sorbet. And so in my head, I like the idea of doing that same twist where it turns out that Denise becomes the actual witch, and so she will then trick our girl into eating the ice cream that she actually made, takes her downstairs, but then instead of sorbet, and my idea would be that it would be sweetheart chocolate. And the idea is that the final ingredient is a heart of someone pure. And so they take her down into the kitchen and they're getting ready to, kill Tammy. But then they turn on Denise and they grab her and she says, "What are you doing? I'm not pure of heart." They say, "Yes, you are. Pure evil." And then they, cut out her heart and they turn her into chocolate. And I don't know if I want the main girl to eat the chocolate as well. Maybe she would, just because she's so enamored. But that's sort of the idea of... to me, yeah, actually, no, I really like that, because then thematically, that's the idea of, we've been talking so much about people being obsessed with you, but the idea of being a fan and obsessed is also kind of creepy. See, I kind of like that ending. That would work. Now, is that better than the story in this book? Well, in a sense, it is the story from this book, minus all the crud, minus the weird one-eyed 13 squirrels, minus the brother who doesn't have a spider until we needed him to have a spider, and then he throws a bag full of spiders on his sister. It's the same story without the weird lead up to some weird celebrity chef that appears and then doesn't affect the story whatsoever. It's a story where we don't have a weird dream kitchen, and in fact, the idea of the ghost and the mummy actually get built up to with tension, rather than just suddenly, ta-da, look at these weird characters. Wow, we could probably make a theme park with these guys. It has a main character who actually cares about cooking and isn't just in there because she wants to be famous. We don't get overcomplicated with the fact that the reason they're making fun of her is because she saw a ghost and they think that that's funny because it makes her seem insane. And it actually has ties back to the idea that bullying doesn't necessarily make you popular, even though that your popularity might make you get away with bullying a lot easier. And most importantly, one of the things I did like, but only gets 2 mentions, is the idea that the reason she's listening to Jake and this ghost is because she thinks he's cute, she has no friends, and so the idea of going straight from no friends Nigel to having a boyfriend is something that she would, probably go to the ends of the earth to do, and so that's why he is able to lead her down the path of darkness into making a blood sacrifice into a food and then feeding it to people. To me, this makes so much more sense. But of course, I am biased there, so again, if you disagree, that's fair enough. But this is the way I see it, because I would have preferred a story that was much simpler like that. But we didn't get that story. Instead, we got this convoluted, silly, goofy, cartoonish in many senses, and mixed up story with all these different ideas in there that was such a mess that I found myself choking on the ridiculous extra elements that weren't adding to the plot. And because I didn't enjoy it so much, I'm afraid this gets a D. Generally, I would not recommend this to anyone. I did not enjoy it, and I'm hoping I'm going to enjoy the other books because it does take a lot of effort to write these books, and I want people to know that although I hated this story, I don't think that's a sign that Scott Charles is a bad writer. I think it's a sign that Scott Charles is not a horror writer, because I can see how this kind of a tone would work for something like a video game adventure story. That kind of makes sense. Or a fantasy story. He's got the right kind of a tone for kids' books. He just doesn't have the right tone for scary kids' books. That's an important distinction I want to make, because I can see the potential here, just not as a horror story. So what can we learn from this book? Well, to me, something that I kept coming back to again and again was the importance of word count. I know for a fact that this book did not have a solid word count, because there's 3 books in this series and they have wildly different page counts. Even just looking at the spines of them, the second book is half the size of the first, and then the third looks smaller than the first, but nowhere near as small as the second one. So clearly there wasn't some consistent word count with all these books. The writer just wrote them until they felt like they were done. And I believe that is the reason why these books feel so bloated with all of these extra ideas, these things that aren't adding to the main plot, weird sidelines with strange characters, the brother acting like a dog, the mother always referring to her daughter like she's a weather event, the fact that there's the 13 one-eyed squirrels, this edition of the Halloween Bake-Off with the mystery chef celebrity judge who turns out to be someone who doesn't matter at all, the weird mind control, the weird quirk of Denise, how she likes using sound effects to creep people out, even though that's potentially ruining an upcoming prank that she's pulling on people. The fact that they even mention offhandedly that Denise steals all of her ideas from other people, which is why our main character says that she wants to earn her celebrity, even though, as I said, she's not actually that much of a good baker. All of this stuff, all of this fluff and padding and other ideas, I'm sure that the writer thought they were cool. And I will freely admit that the idea of giving the villains a secret, lair that you enter into in your dreams, that could be an interesting concept. Or the idea of even the one-eyed 13 squirrels, the idea that they are appearing because they are foreshadowing the events that are to come, but also they're a reference to the horrors that happened in the past. I understand that, but it doesn't fit in this story, in the context of this story. It's just weird. It's not scary. It just seems to come out of nowhere. It doesn't seem to have a proper setup, and so it overbloats the story. And this is why one of the common refrains you hear when people talk about writing is you need to know to murder your darlings. And this is because there are things that we as writers get attached to. I've done it with my own stories. Sometimes I do an awful lot of research into something because I've learned something interesting when it comes to the science behind stuff. I may do an awful lot of research and then I want to put that in the story, only to realize that nobody cares but me. Or more commonly, it'll be something that I think is interesting with the character dynamics, and so I'll add something in, only to realize that that was really just the characters doing their own thing. It wasn't actually advancing the plot. And so that's why you need to understand, when people say murder your darlings, they're simply saying, when you write something, no matter how much you like it, the only value that you need to care about is the value it adds to the story and to the way that the reader is understanding the story. Not how much you liked it, not how much effort you put into it, only what it does for the story. And I feel like the author of this book didn't really do that. But the reason why I'm not focusing on that, and more so I'm focusing on word count, is because I think that the word count is the real core of this matter. I don't think that a book is better because it's longer. I don't think that some books are better because they're really short. I think that consistency is important, especially when doing a series like a chapter spook series, because if you're going to be writing several books and someone picks up one book that feels like a leaflet, and then there's a friggin' door stopper that's further down the shelf, that doesn't feel like a consistent series. It doesn't feel like you know how to write consistently. And what's the kind of consistency I'm talking about is volume and length of book. It also means that you probably can't write consistently when it comes to tone, when it comes to the plot ideas, the characterization. If one story takes you 3 times as long to tell, then what does that say about your ability to consistently tell a good story? And I know it can be daunting if you're a new writer, but especially if you're just getting into the game and you try submitting your stories to places, around 6,000 words is about what people expect, although it does depend on the prompt, but that's what people expect of you. So if you can't consistently write to 6,000 words or thereabouts within the word limit, then you're going to get a lot of stories rejected sight unseen. So try to keep to a word count, maybe even a page count. I generally expect Chapter Spooks books to be about 100 pages minimum and 250 maximum, because if you're over 250 pages, that's not a chapter book, that's a children's novel. And the second thing that this book made me think about, and that I think you can learn from this, is the importance of structure. Now, I've said in the past that I don't worry too much when it comes to structure because I just prefer to worry about tension and relief, but I still find myself subconsciously falling into story structure because it's not only the kind of thing that I find interesting to write, it's the kind of thing that people find interesting to read. That's why story structure exists, because it's a social construct that has evolved over time as we've told stories again and again, and we've realized that the stories that people keep coming back to are the stories that follow these structures. And that's because it has a satisfying, round sort of a feeling to it. You start with the introduction, where you introduce the normal world and your heroes, and then you have the chaotic element, the villains appear, the call to action, where something disrupts that normalcy, which then brings the good and bad into conflict, or it's the good and the chaos, the antagonist. And this results in the climax where one of them comes out on top, or they find some way of working together, which is therefore the resolution, and therefore we return to normal. We get the new normal, some kind of semblance of normality, which is like it was at the beginning, but often changed in a way that cannot be undone. And when you look at this story, you can see why I was thinking about it, because when we're introduced to the normal world in our girl, we do have the in medias res, but what's important is that when you understand her world, she is doing this channel where she makes stuff, and so that's the normal, but then that is twisted because her normal also includes her not caring what's in her food and adding vinegar and soy sauce to it. And so then when we're introduced to this abnormal element, which is that she's has to make these recipes which are gross, well then that detracts from the chaotic element of the antagonist because she's already kind of doing that. So that weakens that introduction. But then when we get to the conflicts, which is meant to be when good faces evil, well, it's not really good faces evil because, first of all, it takes so long to establish whether or not Chef Clarisse or Jake or whoever is evil, but then our main character, I'm not convinced that she's good either. And I'm not talking about the stuff that the book makes her do, things like collecting human blood. I'm talking about the things that she does of her own accord, things like trying to get famous by cheating and not using proper recipes, things that might actually poison people, things like using a spell for slavery and then deciding, hey, I'll use that on my family, things like killing her brother's pet tarantula. These aren't things that I consider to be good by any stretch of the imagination. And so even though this is the climax of the story where evil is meant to be facing off against good, well, it's not really evil facing good, it's evil facing potentially worse evil, and don't even ask me which of the two is meant to be the worst evil in this case. And look, I get that you can have grey morality, you can have stories that play around with different ideas of morality, but in this story they're not doing that. They literally say our main character is too good to be a witch, that's why she fails, and that's why they need Denise at the end of the story. And so the antagonist of this story appears to be her. And I know I kept saying that she's very unlikable, and that would have been fine if the point of the story was her slow corruption, but I never actually get the insistence of a slow corruption. It feels more like she just keeps saying, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, and then she does something horrendous like slavery or murdering her brother's pet, and so it doesn't actually fit within some sort of a tension relief structure. It's just normal, and then bam, and then weird, and then finally we realize who all the antagonists are, and she's then manages to snap out of it at the last second, but her resolution isn't actually to stop them because she doesn't actually resolve anything. And I get that this is a horror story, and I get that you can sort of break the rules. I've talked about this before. One of the things I love about horror is that you can sort of break the rules of comfort and structure by changing the rules, but by changing it in this way, it just feels like the story doesn't end. And so even though I was done with it, I could tell that the story wasn't done because they actually hadn't wrapped up the main conflict. And so the big twist at the end, where it reveals that actually it was Denise who turns out to be an evil witch the whole time, even though it was meant to be a twist, I was expecting a twist, and so it wasn't all that shocking. So, all of that is to say that structure matters because it gives you a template around which you can organize the emotional highs and lows of your story in a way that is resonant with your readers, with your audience. This story didn't have a really strong emotional core, and some of that has to do with the writing and the inconsistency in tone, but some of it definitely came down to the lack of a good structure that you could follow. And yes, you can break the rules of structure, but you can't break all of the rules at once, because then you don't have a story, then you just have a ridiculous mess. And I'm not saying this book broke all the rules, but it broke enough of them, especially at the beginning and near the end, that every single attempt at building tension fell flat. So yes, please adhere to structure, understand structure, and whilst I do say that certain genres, and especially if you're a talented writer, you can break those rules, remember when it comes to this kind of thing, breaking the rules is a sometimes treat. Because if you're always breaking the rules, then they're not really rules, are they? So that was Creeptown #1, The Final Ingredient. And I'm sorry to say that I hated it as much as I did. It was very frustrating. I'm hoping to enjoy the next one more. I mean, it's called The Bone Taker, and it sounds really creepy. I'm hoping that it's going to be scary, and it's got a lot less pages, so maybe a shorter word count means that we can have a much more consistent and less overblown and bloated story. And genuinely, I do feel bad that I've been bashing on this because this guy does seem like he's a younger writer. So my review of this book is, when it comes to Creeptown, The Final Ingredient, read Video Game Elementary, because that seems like it's this guy's wheelhouse. Because unfortunately, I really didn't enjoy this. I'm going to go cook my dinner, and I promise it's not going to have eyeballs and spiders in it. But hey, if you thought this was scary, just wait to see what I've got in store for you next time.